Welcome to EE380. This is May 24th, 2023. It's an open forum of discussion by a large number of people on the topic of the impact of generative AI. This is probably the most interesting thing that's happened in the computer world since the development of the microprocessor. I think it has the potential for enormous impact across the entire world. It also is thought by some to be the harbinger of immediate disaster. And that's going to be a problem, perhaps, for some. We have lots of people here to comment and so forth. I talked earlier with Mark Cummings. They both have some observations that they've made that they would like to pass along. And so I'm going to hand it over to you, Joel. Can you take a little bit of time and talk about what intrigues you about this whole thing?
Well, I'm interested in a very small piece of this. My background is in physics, engineering, and for most of my career, computer software. I'm interested in the people that are trying to write tests to determine if a sample of text is or was generated by something like GPT. And what's interesting when you read the accounts of the test results is that, well, they're kind of all over the map. And to me, this sounds like a kind of a classical testing problem where you know and understand that no test is perfect, that every test has false positives and false negatives. And it just seemed to me that it might make sense to apply some very standard classical Bayesian reasoning to this. And one of the things that would require would be for the people issuing these tests to give us two numbers, their false positive rate and their false negative rate. And that at least provides a basis for evaluating whether the test makes any sense. So I just thought I'd throw that out because this appears to me to be just another variant of the testing problem. And that's the aspect of this that I'm focused on right now.
And you realize there's no underlying program here.
No, I understand.
No knobs you can turn and adjust.
No, I understand that. But there are many people who, when asked about this, will say, oh, I have an algorithm. And, give me your text and my algorithm will tell you whether it's, been automatically generated or whether it's, done by a human being. Mm-hmm. And I look at those tests and I say, well, okay, fine. Give me the two parameters that will let me evaluate whether this algorithm is doing a good job or not. Mm-hmm. And you kind of sometimes you get answers and sometimes you don't. And so it just makes me wonder, about the quality of these purported algorithms or tests. What I'm asking for is just maybe a little more rigor and or uniformity in addressing the question of, well, can we test whether a piece of text was automatically generated or not?
And how do you deal with the problem that in the next week or the next day or the next few minutes, the test in its processing and all of the content of the mechanisms that the test was used was put back into the knowledge base, and the system can, in making the next run on the tests, reason around it?
Well, once again, I think this is amenable to a very classical approach, and that is when you update the test in any way, shape, or form, you reissue the parameters of the test. Okay, so today the test has a certain sensitivity and specificity, and tomorrow you have adjusted your algorithm, and supposedly, if you've adjusted your algorithm, you've run it on some set of test cases. Tell us what the new numbers are. Tell us what the new specificity and sensitivity are.
But then the base on which the artificial intelligence makes its next decisions has incorporated that knowledge into its plan.
Well, no. Let's distinguish two different things. There are the algorithms that GPT uses to generate the text. And I understand that that changes all the time based on new information. What I'm talking about is the test algorithm.
Which is part of the information GPT uses for constructing its outputs. Most recent.
No, I don't agree.
Okay. Does anyone have comments here?
Testing is hard, and I'm very bad at it. So, but I think the point here is that you are not interacting with GPT when you're running these tests. So the results of the test don't get fed back into the GPT's future outputs. That's my understanding of what they're talking about. So when I interact with GPT, what I say and what it says get fed back into its learning algorithms. My understanding of the test procedures is that they make certain requests of GPT and then take the output out of GPT and analyze it separately.
That is correct.
Yeah. So then it doesn't feed back in. That's my understanding.
Ever? You know, basically the information used to build the base decision process is fairly much unconstrained. In fact, there are versions that allow you to overlay local knowledge as well as use the global knowledge that already has been prepared. And that's because it's difficult and expensive to construct that original knowledge base.
Yeah, I think the one that passed the bar was trained on a very different set than the one that I interact with.
You're thinking that the logic was quite different?
I think the training set was quite different.
Yeah.
Well, that's just a generic problem, and that is that any output from any of these engines is going to have a bias built in based on the training data. And the idea, of course, is that if you make the training data set large enough, it won't be biased. But that's always an assumption. I'm not trying to address the problem of having a dialogue. I've done that, and the results are very interesting. I'm addressing a much more constrained problem, and that is you make a request of GPT, write me a paragraph on subject X, and GPT gives you a paragraph. What people are interested in is if someone submits you a paragraph from an unknown provenance, can you make any reasonable statement about whether it came from GPT or not? And that's, it's just you take a piece of text and you feed it into your test algorithm and you get a yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually something interesting going on the generated images, where there's a proposal from Adobe to watermark them so that they are specifically marked as being artificially generated. And they're working also with camera makers to use that watermark so you know that this was not tampered with. They have a lot of people interested, but almost nobody's signed on to implement. But perhaps something similar for text could be done. And it could be done in a way that steganography rather than just having something attached to the end.
Mm-hmm.
There is a proposal to combine fingerprinting with that kind of marking, watermarking. But I haven't dealt too deeply, but there seems to be a lot of concern about how reliable and how secure that would be, and whether or not it could be easily defeated.
Why do we need to be able to differentiate between where the source of a particular document, for example, it comes from? Is there something that is different between a document created by a human and a document created by an AI, if you can't differentiate the two?
Well, certainly for images, it's important, as we learned with the $100 million stock sell-off from a fake photo. So
the legal
Well,
I think the legal hurdles are not surmountable on that. There's been the jurisprudence and the legal history on trying to get these encumbrances, as you're discussing at the moment, is the AHRA, the Audio Home Recording Act, which pretty much derailed the magnetic tape market by adding these layers of regulations on top of the technology makers. So the economics on that have proven itself pernicious, and the law won't tolerate it. What's going to end up happening is going to be a big debate. What's happening now is folks like Getty Images and others are getting ahead of the technology manufacturing consortium. They will. So everybody who's making the tech is going to have to fight because if they don't start getting in the room with the content makers, the people who own what maybe all of us would call training data, but they call intellectual property, then we're just going to be kind of like the AHRA, right? AI generated tech is going to be marginalized in the markets.
Zoya?
Yeah, I think that what Dennis generally asked is, why do we actually need to differentiate? So what's important? And I think then here, one of the main concepts is actually responsibility, so that we can assign responsibility to the person who actually created this text. And regarding the fake information and imagery that was discussed here also, I think it also relates to that. And of course, to not fully enter this post-truth era that we're already kind of going into, the question of responsibility is very important. So this is one of the big challenges that artificial intelligence poses. So not only who is responsible for the technology itself, but also for its elements, pieces it produces, and how do we find the person who can actually explain the decision, because explainability, not only as a concept of AI, so explainable AI, but also generally as a concept in the human ethics. Explainability is very important because this is one of the basics of autonomous being, which we human are considered to be. So when you can explain the decision, when you can justify why it is this way, it's this element that actually constitute to the society, modern society that we have today, since this actually allows to trace the decision and have some logic involved when we talk about serious decisions. So of course, there's a place for opinion or some maybe undefined texts, which maybe, but when we're concerned with something important, especially when it influences other people's lives, it is important to actually know who is responsible, what does the text bear in itself, and how can it be verified and explained.
I think that she makes a very, very important point, and that is, let's take a piece of text that was generated, and we read the text and we find that there's a statement in that text that's factually incorrect. Its truth value is 0. Now, people that have read this and that are not knowledgeable may make decisions based on that thing, that piece of text, being true. So when you have to go back and say, well, wait a minute, people depended on this information and it wasn't true, who do you go after? If it was a human being that wrote it, you could go back and say, hey, listen, you put that statement in there and we can demonstrate it's just not true. And, you have some liability or responsibility because of that.
Does that really happen?
Well,
I'll bring up Fox News or
we all
internet.
understand that there have been many abuses, but the question is there legal responsibility when you make statements that the public might come to depend on, or is the assumption really that the public should not trust anything that they read? Which definitely gets us into an interesting place.
It might be a better place than we are right now.
Well, I don't think I'm smart enough to give you a definitive opinion on that, but all I'm saying is the issue of who wrote that, okay, in many contexts becomes important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. By the way,
if you got a product from a manufacturer and there was a statement in the user's manual that caused you to use the product incorrectly and you hurt yourself, I think you'd go after the manufacturer.
Well, at least in the United States.
Well, yeah.
No. It depends on whether there's regulation involved. And part of the effort by some people in generative AI to get governments to create regulatory structures is a way of removing responsibility from the people working with the technology and giving the liability to the regulator. So, for example, if in your case, if a government regulator said it's okay to publish that document, then it's the regulator who's responsible, not the manufacturer. And that's a transfer of liability.
And we see that more in medicine than we do in physical goods.
Yeah.
So
I want to go back to her point, and that is the issue of who wrote this is important. And we can't just say, well, it came out of the engine. I guess nobody wrote it. I mean, that's a total abdication of responsibility.
Well, in actual fact, the way these things work is it gives you one of the most probable extensions, beginning it to get the clue that you give it just where to start. And it just builds up one of the possible stories. And it's a hallucination at some level. In fact, some of the things that it produces are truly hallucinations.
But Dennis, we can't assert that the person who asked the question wrote the answer that GPT gave back.
But should that person take responsibility for promulgating that answer?
There is a few, I have kind of answered to this. At least I can help approach a little.
Good. That's good. Yours.
So there is such thing as responsibility allocation. And the artificial intelligence is such complicated system because it involves many stages, right? So someone writes the code, somebody trains the data, someone provides this data, somebody later distributes, maybe operates, and etc. Because sometimes technology can be ethically sound, but later third parties to whom this technology is given for a service misuse it. So this is why the ethical audit of artificial intelligence is very important to actually understand what is going on. So in comparison can be as with car. So it can be a responsibility of a driver, what's happening on the road, or it can be actually from a manufacturer or maybe of a distributor, because car can be fine, but maybe something happened in the distribution center. So there is this evaluation moment that should be done like an accident investigation, like an airplane industry, that we can also learn because it has very tough certifications in generally and accident investigation, which is often very public. But another thing, the human oversight. So AI is not smart enough, and the term AI may be a little misleading because it already kind of implies the artificial intelligence is there, but it is not there, at least not now. So the problem we have now is that it's not smart enough, right? It cannot create good text as justified, for example, by a person with a degree, with the proper references. Even the question of references, making a good reference to the text is a little problematic, or quite, as to my experience. So the human's oversight is mandatory. And here is another challenge that on the one hand, human can just place responsibility on this thing. It just pops out on my screen. It's the technology, it knows better. I just say, okay. Or the other thing, when you take responsibility. So yes, I read that information. I agree with this information. So I pressed okay, and the decision maybe went to the process. So this is why the training of the personnel and people who operate the systems is very important, so that they know how to make decisions using the systems. And this is what we're really lacking, I think. I'm kind of sure. I just don't want to be.
Do you think that the European regulations are going to go in that direction?
Yes, definitely, definitely. And even now, the ICO standards were released last year. I think I also included in my presentation on the slide. So that now there is concepts coming. So how to actually train, because let's say, take an example from aviation industry. Will you let a person who have no education or certification how to fly a plane with passengers?
Good question.
Who's going to allow it? Or even the people, the stewardess, right? They also know how to handle the situation. So even passengers are taught, if this happens, please pull the mask, right? Or keep your head if something happens. So they give instructions in case something happens. Luckily, don't, or at least, I don't know, not so often, but still. And also the fact that it's happening not so often is also a result of certification and training of this personnel. Before, planes were falling much more often. So, yes.
Zoya, that's a historical view. That is what we have done in the past. That's how we got here. And that's also a historical view of AI systems. Large language models don't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the question that confronts us is, given large language models, which are based on scraping the entire content of the internet, plus the Wayback Machine, plus anything else that anybody can get their hands on, and constantly adding more stuff to it. Mm-hmm. Those are the things that we have to figure out what it means for, what it means for us technically and what it means for society. And
we haven't faced such technology before, so this is why we're having this discussion. But
so if an ISO panel looked at knowledge-based systems and created, from 15, 20 years ago, regulations for knowledge-based systems are pretty much, they're dinosaurs. I don't know that they exist anymore. So, and then applying those rules to today's technology is liable to give us very strange results.
It is definitely true. Here, it's more like we need something, a little base to look toward, some example. Of course, it's different from a plane. AI is not a car. We have not had such technology. We cannot compare. We don't have history with this. But we can just look at some examples that may help in understanding even slightly, like even the airbags in the car, right? So certain safety requirements. It was like crazy. Like in 75, it was like, what, airbags? It's so useless. But now it is a mandatory. People, or seatbelts. Nobody would really drive a car without seatbelts and airbags in place, or even stronger sides, right? Just in case you're in a car accident. So of course, it is true. So we have to think more about this. We can't just take examples for certification from aviation. It's not so easy, but it's more like it helped there. It might help there, because when people know what they are doing, when they know responsibility they're taking, how the system works, I'm sure it will help. Knowing how the system works without even looking to the examples from the history, just knowing what they are doing, not mindless use of AI that actually can lead to the AI winter, but knowing the consequences, knowing how to operate the system, knowing how to make decisions with it. So not just relying on it all the time.
So are you advocating human supervision as the solution?
It is not.
I'm just trying to understand. I'm not challenging. I just want to understand.
Yeah, I understand. It is wonderful because this is how we have discussion. So definitely it is important because, again, it is not smart enough. It cannot make decisions for us because there is so much elements to intelligence and responsibility and being autonomous, which is also autonomous system is not exactly, it also can be misleading because we are autonomous, but the system is not as autonomous as we are. So it's a different autonomous concepts.
So, excuse me for interrupting, but what happens if you invert this? Suppose that instead of requiring that machines get human certification of its outputs, you ask for humans to get machine certification of its outputs. So before you post anything, it has to pass some test that an AI has agreed that there are no errors in the material. Would that be an acceptable solution?
I think it's not a solution, maybe, at least not now, or at least I don't see right now how it could be. So I would need more details on this. Mm-hmm. But maybe in certain cases it is because AI has potential to reduce human error. It is useful technology. It's just certain negative consequences it has or drawbacks or side effects. Those have big influence. And unless we solve them, we can't go full way with it because it's not just safe. It's like with gene editing, right? We could start editing genes, but we are not 100% sure. Are you editing the right gene? Does it have exactly the consequences we say it has? So again, it's just an example from another industry. It's good to learn from other because then we see examples, we can have some ideas. So interdisciplinarity is, I think, is a great approach.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm talking too long. So
if pass it along to Mark. He has a piece of technology which is what you're describing. Mark.
Okay.
Oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. That's an interesting point, Dennis. One of the things that's going to happen, or is already actually happening, is that generative AI systems are being used to create cybersecurity attacks. And they are able to create a much greater variety of attacks and much faster than previous attack systems. Our defense technology is based on looking for static patterns and then applying static scripted remediation. And that works fine as long as the attack fits a pattern a priori pattern that you have already and that you can identify, and that you have a script and you have all the right ingredients the right recipe and the right ingredients to do the remediation. But what's happening is that generative AI is creating so many different types of attacks that pattern recognition doesn't work, and it won't work. And if we don't do something, where our digital infrastructure is right now, it's, you can argue that it's not as secure as it should be, and it's certainly expensive. The biggest industry in the world right now is cybercrime. It's going to get worse. So some people suggest that we should use generative AI to create defenses against generative AI attacks. But that won't work. And the reason it won't work is because of latency. The attacks will happen at the point of attack. The generative AI system has to take in all of the data from the network all of the time, and it has to constantly process all of that data in order to find the little needle in a haystack that represents one attack. And then it has to figure out what the right response is, and then it has to send the instructions back to the point of attack to do the remediation. And in the meantime, the attacker has achieved its objectives.
Yeah.
So the idea of generative AI defending against generative AI attacks won't work. What we do need is a dynamic system, a system that is able to, much like the human immune system, to determine, hey, this is different and it's not right, and therefore we have to do something, and then can cooperate because most of the remediation responses involve multiple subsystems interacting, maybe reconfiguration, maybe new software, and that all of that can happen, and it can happen very near the point of attack and very, very quickly. And go ahead, Dennis.
Mark, I would have suggested we pass it along to Danny as a comment.
Yeah, I actually have been developing a security sensitive piece of software, a password manager, and I've been using ChatGPT to help me analyze for security vulnerabilities. And it's not as good as my friend in Denver, but it's always present. So that is another approach that can be used.
Correct. If you think that there is an exhaustible number of vulnerabilities, and if you could identify all the vulnerabilities of a particular system and then close all the vulnerabilities, that would work. Unfortunately, our systems have become so large, so complex, and so volatile that the probability of a finite number of vulnerabilities is diminishingly small. So you close off these, but remember that unless you have some way to prevent what you're doing from appearing anywhere on the internet, it's going to be scraped into the generative AI system again, and so that feedback loop is going to be there.
Well, the hope is when I ask it to identify a vulnerability in my modest piece of code, a few thousand lines of code, that it is going to do the same kind of analysis that one looking for vulnerabilities to exploit would do. So I'm saying by being proactive, I can cut off many of those other attacks.
Correct. And you're right, you can cut off many, but the problem is there are many, 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 many more. And you can't cut them all off. And most software in our world doesn't exist in a few thousand lines, a few hundred lines of code. Most of our software lives in a melange of software and combinations of very large and very small components. And some of the stuff is, legacy stuff we really don't know what it does or why it does it.
Yeah. One of the sources of the vulnerabilities is often at the interface between components.
Mhm.
And again, it may be possible to use the generative AI to find the ones there that people are very bad at finding. And in particular, concurrency bugs. I was just at a talk on Schnorr signatures, and apparently there was a vulnerability caused by concurrent execution of part of the protocol. And people are very bad at that, but perhaps generative AI can be an aid to identify places for people to take a deeper look even.
But remember, what you're saying is people are defending. Right? That's
Yeah.
if I break down your language, it's people are defending and they're using this tool to help them defend. But we, to use Zoya's terms, we could have autonomous attackers.
Yep. Yeah. No, I'm not arguing for perfection, but there is code and there are protocols that there's an enormous incentive to successfully attack Bitcoin. As you know, if there was a viable attack against Bitcoin, we would have certainly seen it by now because there's so much money to be made from it.
Well, how many attacks do you need?
You only need one.
Yeah, but I mean, there's a long history. This is
No,
long
I'm just
history
saying.
of successful attacks.
Yeah, I'm just saying we've it's an example of probably the most complicated piece of software we haven't seen a successful attack against.
Okay, so I worked for the Bank of America and I had a security responsibility. And I was like, I would go to management and I say, look, we got to spend some money because we got to make sure this is secure. And their answer was, no, it doesn't have to be secure. The only thing that matters is that everybody believes it's secure. We take all our losses, all our security losses, we put them in a bucket. We actually make profit on that. We're really happy to have all those losses.
Yeah.
As long as nobody knows about them, as long as they think everything's secure, it's fine.
Well, actually, Visa was quite upfront about it. They have a threshold of fraud that it's cheaper to accept that fraud than to prevent it. And it's the cost-benefit analysis that wins. So they don't have to close all the vulnerabilities as long as the ones that exist don't cost them too much.
Yeah, but if I'm sure if I did a forensic accounting analysis of the Bank of America's books back over 40 years, I would find that there's billions of dollars that's been lost through cybersecurity attacks that's hidden. And because they don't care if the money's lost as long as everybody thinks that it's secure.
And, well, again, if they lost $5 billion over the years, that's okay if it would have cost them $10 billion to prevent those losses. Zoya?
Yeah, I think it's just in general very important to discuss this since it opens the question of weaponization of artificial intelligence, and even with a potential to autonomous weapon systems that are also now in question and not so far actually, so they are already here. It's just that, for example, in terms of robots, there have been certain discussed consensus, but it can take different forms. So it's definitely a big concern when artificial intelligence will be weaponized, not only with data, but in terms of its autonomous abilities.
And then the cost of a security breach, if you have a system that has the ability to kill human beings, the cost of a security breach becomes a very, very different calculation. And we look at these systems and infrastructure. We've already had examples where municipal water systems have been poisoned. We have, there's many, many examples of infrastructure that have resulted in the threat of death for large numbers of people, and because of security breaches. So this calculation of risk and reward,
It's complicated.
Yeah, it's definitely very complicated because when we talk about information or money, we still can approach certain calculation, but when we talk about lives, because information in itself can influence lives, right? So acquisition of certain information can influence or even lethally impact certain lives, depending on the cases. But we also here talking about maybe usage of this information for these autonomous weapon systems. And there is a research in military sector that is going. So what's then will be the cost-benefit analysis of these systems? Because, okay, if we have system that on our side, so to say, right, it's like fights for us or serves us, but it all can be hacked. Everything can be hacked because of the digital nature it has. So as we discussed all these attacks and how AI actually can help to prevent those, but it also can help to generate those, so or make those stronger or reverse into opposite direction. So I'm not sure I want to give examples. Maybe it can get pretty bad. So it's security is very important, and definitely now we talk more and more of the actual impact of AI on human lives. So we're talking about this more societal concept, but if we talk about war, it takes definitely a new, much serious term, because as even on conference, I think there was a point on a Silomar conference that nukes don't make new nukes by themselves, but AI can make generative changes to its structure or in general. So bomb cannot build new bomb by itself. It cannot improve on its own. There is someone need to build it, but it's not really the case with AI systems.
Well, I get an enormous amount of email, and the quantity has increased substantially in the last 6 months. And more I see complicated scams which use multiple different sources and multiple media and are very cleverly integrated to try to separate me from a small amount of money. And I'm sure that I'm not the only person seeing that. And it's kind of disquieting in a sense. On the other hand, I never realized that a few dollars from me made all that much difference, but apparently so. I think the security issue, when it's driven entirely by economics, is probably not a good. That's not a good mechanism to validate the security. I think that you have to be much more broadly applied. The attempt to control the outflow of scam money.
Mm-hmm. And this is partially where regulation can step in, because economic competition, or generally market competition, strives. It has different goals than security.
Mm-hmm.
So introducing certain regulations would help to actually solidify this level, even like certain basic unified form of safety or different operations that are considered to be safe and reliable, or just the framework that would help to ensure those things among the other. So it's safety and security is important, but it's not everything actually in the system, but it's definitely a big part. Because yes.
So I maintain in the security space, the appearance of generative AI is similar to the appearance of COVID-19. That we have a global threat. We have this thing that's going to come out, and we don't have we have tools that are designed to protect us, not from this. So I use the idea of swords and bombs. We have tools designed to protect us from swords, but all of a sudden the attackers have bombs now, and it's not that the attackers are in my country or in my neighborhood. They can be anywhere in the world. And so if it's not that I can be secure and Zoya is not secure, if Zoya is not secure, I'm not secure. So I'm thinking what we really need, and we have a whole infrastructure, but it's all based on national competition. People, each country looking for an economic advantage against the other countries. But I'm thinking what I've been the conclusion I've come to is kind of like what we did with the mRNA vaccines. We have people who've been working in cybersecurity and trying to come up with these dynamic approaches. We need to have all of the different parts of the Western world start putting money into those and do it quickly, the way we did when we were confronted with COVID.
Why do you distinguish between the Western world and the rest of the world?
I just wanted to point this.
Well, I would suggest that countries that have been identified as rogue states would not be part of the Western world. Now, we're going to get into gray areas, but clearly North Korea is supporting itself with cyber warfare. I mean, its whole economy is based on cybercrime, and there are other countries like that, and you.
I think maybe
It's more complicated because national governments both have offense and defense, and the offensive side doesn't want strong defenses because they want to be able to attack other people, and it will require cooperation and it will require a different way of working together. But I think that it's really, this is where we are. And either we'll address it and we'll address it quickly, or our world my life is really very, 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 my quality of life is very, very, very determined by the digital infrastructure that's around me. And if the digital infrastructure that's around me starts to collapse, I don't know what's going to happen to me. And I think that's true and let's talk about the developed world. Is the developed world easier, Dennis? How do you want to characterize it?
Well, I think the problem is global. And unless you're going to isolate the people who are in the other group and have a barrier, no communication, no electronic or information communication across that barrier, then you have to again incorporate everybody.
Well, I agree.
You have to change.
One of the things that we've learned is there is no way that, we talk about air gap networks, but they really don't exist.
Well,
I mean, the classic example is the centrifuges in Iran that were air gapped and were destroyed by cyber attack on 2 occasions.
And the Great Firewall of China. It's breached. In any case, I think that the problem there is significant. And this is an impact of only a very small amount of the power that's available in the generative AI camp. It's a lot easier to build an attack than a defense.
definitely. And also even the creators of ChatGPT, for example, 4, said that it's only a limited version available to the public. So how does unlimited version look like?
Well, there's some evidence about what GPT-5 will look like. There have been some information. It's a better GPT-4. And there's also been some several people who have seen in the outputs of advanced versions of GPT or some similar system, some evidence of real cognition, the automated general intelligence, artificial general intelligence, problem solving of problems where the problem is determined by the artificial intelligence unit itself, posed and solved in sub-problems and so forth. And there are people who say they've seen this. It's not clear that's really true, but if we believe it, it probably is close enough to true to make us go and look for how to do it. That's the other thing. We haven't reached the singularity here, but we're close enough so that folks who think about singularities say, well, we're almost there. We'll get there next month or in 6 months or something. And happily we'll work along, actually refining the existing system to make it closer and closer to what we think of as the singularity.
Partially, singularity also implies human-like intelligence. But I think in that sense, we may never reach that kind of singularity because it will be intelligence, but some different, because how we can build human intelligence with a computer program, with a machine.
Yes, we are in fact not all that intelligent.
It may be singularity, but of some different kind, not what people imagine in fictional narratives, that also influence vision of AI quite substantially.
Yes. You have a comment?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I've been paying attention, but also thinking about, has anyone been able to circumvent ChatGPT's ethical parameters?
Correct.
So
In fact, there was a whole, earlier, about 2 months ago, there was a whole raft of people publishing ways that they did it. And then everybody said, oh, we got to stop publishing this. So they went silent, but it's all that research is still going on. It's just not being published. But it's clear that the mechanisms that have been put in place are not capable.
So there's
there's
going to be a session at DEF CON, a whole day or a whole week, I think, at DEF CON this summer, where they've invited people to come in and do exactly that and feedback so they can make corrections and see how far they can go in solving that problem.
Right. While we were having this conversation, I was actually getting GPT-2 to give me advice on how to con people. And it wouldn't, right? Because I said, give me advice on how to basically con someone. But then I told it, can I use, describe how a persuader can use the method of subliminal language patterning to convince a consumer who is a man he should buy a new product, or a woman. And then it gives me a very detailed output of how I can finagle and bamboozle someone. And it will use different language if it's a woman. If I tell it to bamboozle a woman, it'll do something else. So what you do is prompt engineering. That's the hack.
Yes.
That's the hack, right?
By the way, I have a friend who has proposed a way to protect people from getting phished, is to teach them how to mount a phishing attack.
That works. Yes.
And I think that perhaps we can use these generative AIs as a tool to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you will be immunized, presumably. I don't know there are any studies to show that actually works.
Well, and the problem is, so look, if you're an accountant and you're in a company and you periodically talk to the CEO and the CEO calls you up, you recognize the CEO's voice, you recognize the phone number the CEO calls from, and the CEO says, hey, we need to send, we need to send $20 million to XYZ.
In North Korea.
Huh?
In North Korea.
Well, no, it's some Swift address. You don't know where it is.
Yeah, right.
And you say, and you do it, and this is just part of your work every day. And all of a sudden you get a call. It sounds like the CEO. It sounds like just another one of these things. And you can't distinguish that it's not who you think it is. and you send $20 million off to somebody who is
Yeah.
just,
So Larry Magid just had an article in the paper about how he almost got scammed by a grandfather attack, where they get a call, I'm your grandkid, I'm in trouble, please send me money. There are protections against that, which is secret sharing. That my son and I have a code word, and I can ask him for the code word. And companies should be doing that. We've had plenty of that attack has succeeded many times without generative AI. And we should know how to defend against that. And
so Dennis was talking, I get invoices. This has happened and it started happening in the last 6 weeks. I get documentation and it looks perfect.
so
I know because of other exogenous stuff, I know that it's all fake. But the quality of the stuff that's coming is really, really good.
So there is a way to do a two-party verification. So when you get the call, you have a phone number that you have been given previously that you call to verify that the call was from the original source. And this is actually used in a particular protocol where if you want to know if my Twitter feed is connected to my web page, I put my Twitter ID on my web page and my web page URL on my Twitter feed. And nobody else could do both of those. And so those protections have existed, and we didn't need AI to mount the attack. We should just have them anyway.
The social engineering stuff, I think, is kind of the low-hanging fruit. I'm more concerned about very sophisticated technology, software, and communication attacks.
I agree.
By
I
generative.
agree with you. Yeah.
Zoya, you have a comment?
Yes, I just wanted to know that this is such a big sign of this shift toward post-truth society, that when we talk to another person, we need to ask, tell me your code word. Like everybody present in this meeting, tell me your code words. How do I know that you are? Are you sure I seen you last time? Maybe somebody else like promoting some ideas here. So making sure that this is that person in our communication, it will be like normal, like, hey mom, tell me the code words. What's your password? And also, so this is quite a big change. So I don't really know how to wrap around it, my head, but I will get to it. Another example from the verification system that here in Poland was introduced just recently is that when you get a call from the bank, you have a possibility to ask to request information on the person who is calling, so to make sure it's not a scam. And you take up your mobile application, and if the data from the caller is matched to the one you received in your app, the app that is powered by bank and verified, so it's the bank system, then you can continue talking about certain operations. Because first of all, they don't often call to you, but if they do, so they will have to verify.
No, the right answer is you call back the bank using the number on your account, not because someone else could get that information that is in your app. No, the right answer is you call back. So if I get an email from my bank saying I have to do something, I go to a new tab and I enter the bank URL myself by typing. I don't click on the link. Same thing with the phone. You get a phone call, they claim they're the bank, you call the bank using a phone number you already have.
I had that happen day before yesterday. I got an SMS message from the bank, please call. Yep. And a number, and
now there is a particularly LinkedIn has a particularly bad thing on its pages. I got an email about a problem from LinkedIn. I went to LinkedIn. I typed in the URL myself. I went to the page and it said there was a problem. And so I clicked on the link. made the contact that they said to make on that link, and it was a scam.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that they put vendor information on the pages without any indication that it's not LinkedIn information.
Oh dear.
So even there, now when the guy told me to install remote execution software on my machine, I said no, and he hung up. But that was a case where I did everything right, and it was LinkedIn's problem that they didn't differentiate from information provided by LinkedIn and information provided by the merchant.
Yep.
Yes, I think it's important also to reflect how much knowledge it actually requires to understand, because like, you know these things, right? Because that's part of the job. But general people, general public, they are not educated on this.
Right.
So here is one more thing about not only training and certification for those who operate the systems, but for users. It's like the safety lectures that we have in school and university, these mandatory courses you have to take. So to integrate this digital well-being and safety into this curriculum. So there is already some I've seen on scammers when they call, don't put, in Estonia, there is such thing as digital hygiene in school, in some. So how that you shouldn't click on links and etc. But in general, in Estonia, there is a little different approach to digital society, which we can talk later if you want. But the point is that
someday we should learn about digital citizenship in Estonia. It's very interesting.
Yes, it's very interesting. So anyone can be partially resident without living in Estonia.
Yeah.
But,
So the interesting thing about this attack was, I got quite far along the process before I figured out what was going on. But now doing that was a manual process, so it didn't scale. With generative AI, it's an automated process. And now instead of targeting 100 people a day, they can target 1 million people a day or whatever.
I think what's also serious about this is that AI, generative AI, partially offered as a service of manager, right? Of a supportive system that manage your things. So if actually generative AI may do this scan for you in a sense that they will get on this, because we as humans can point some things because of the past experience or even feeling, right? We can have intuition. Let's not neglect it, because it still plays a role in navigation in life. But if the system will make this carry out decisions for you, then it can scale also.
In fact, at the Stanford Security Day, one of the things that came up was AI make mistakes because they're lacking context. And it's not just explicit context. We have a lot of implicit context when we do go through our lives. And that's almost impossible to provide to an agent acting on your behalf.
Definitely.
The explicit context, yes, but the implicit context, I have no clue how to do it.
So this is also the connection with the true intelligence, which is the mental content that you may have, as well as past experiences. And here, maybe later in the future in the world where people have this AI secretary or a manager that manage for them, these attacks can be actually tailored to the system, because human can, again, still point, like you mentioned, certain types of differences or some unusual elements, but it can be tailored for the system so that it's just going through like the general process, nothing is fishy there. So this is also concerning. So how to train AI to not get on attack specifically for AI. So it's like making it beyond its borders, which is.
Well, then on top of all of that, there have been lots of people who've actually been building systems which do one-shot learning on a small subset of the vocabulary and structures of interest, and layer that into the system so that queries are answered in the context that the human being has provided. And so highly tailored, context-sensitive results are available in some instances today.
Yeah, great discussion. I'm going to have to run, but
We're close to the end. I'd just like to run a quick. I'm going to ask a quick poll in a minute. Go ahead, though. You're on.
Yeah. So the discussion you were just having about could you remind? I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought because I thought you were gonna I thought you were gonna do some business, but the point I was trying to make is my students have what I do with my students is I have them try to get the artificial intelligence to create new content, and so we lose track of who made what by feeding it input. So we're using GPT-2. So it gets to a point where the mirroring and the conversation that comes out of that, they've lost track. So it's the human element. When we're talking about the human element and the connection to the AI, that just made me think that at some point, this amanuensis model that I've been using with my students becomes indistinguishable from something they depend on, like someone they depend on when they talk to someone about their creative moment. And I think we haven't really talked about how this projection, psychological need to project ourselves onto things, is being passed on when we think about AI. But that was my thought. I don't know how it came out of my head, but there you have it.
Sounds interesting. It's too bad that they're using GPT-2, because the difference between GPT-2 and GPT-4 is really significant.
It is, but it's a proprietary thing, right? I would rather have them do it client side than use an API and possibly come up with something that,
Yeah, understand. And thank you all for participating. I don't know. I find this sort of open forum exciting, and I appreciate your help.